ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。Welcome to Backward Engineering Your Script. I know that I've done several episodes of this before, but I thought it was time to go over some of the reasons for calling it Backward Engineering Your Script and tell you what the real purpose of me doing this series of videos is about. Number one, the reason it's called backward engineering your script is all too often writers tend to forward engineer their script. This is especially true of writers when they're in film school or when they're on their own and they're trying to write something that they think will ultimately sell and make them into someone who can make a living out of being a writer. That's a very good ambition. But a lot of times, what it leads to is it leads to a little bit of confusion. It leads to a little bit of panic. It leads to a little bit of a sense that maybe I'm not right for this job. Why? Because there's no guidance from the outside. And one of the reasons there's no guidance from the outside is if you look at most of the textbooks on writing, whether it be Sid Field or whether it be David Trottier or Bob McKee, is they present an idealized world of Hollywood. And that idealized world of Hollywood and the examples that they give you are always examples of movies that are masterpieces. And how can you compete with a masterpiece when you're first starting out? It seems like a mountain that's much too hard to climb. The truth is that screenwriting is indeed a very, very difficult thing to do successfully, but it has a lot of kickoffs to it. There's a lot of jobs that are associated with having tried to write a screenplay and actually seeing whether or not it fits you or not, and if so, how your talent fits in with what the industry needs for any given moment are. And I've also found that a lot of the books tend to be very prescriptive, meaning that they seem to have an idea that there's one correct way to write a screenplay and that everything else is in some form or another wrong. Well, that doesn't account for the vast number of hits that have happened over time that don't conform to those rules. Moreover, it can be intimidating to someone who's first starting out because they can feel that there's all of these rules and it's actually constricting their ability to write. So part of this is to also act as an encouragement for those of you who are indeed fearing that you're stuck, fearing that you're blocked, how to get past those areas, how to stop feeling that way, because you can't write a masterpiece if you never finish it. So therefore, my goal throughout this series is to help you actually finish something. And from there, you can make a decision. Is it worthy of further revision? Do you find that you would go to see the movie? Do your friends, who you can somehow convince to read it, probably by agreeing to read theirs, do they feel that there's any potential here? There's certain flaws with doing that as well, but we'll go into that a little bit later. And as a reminder, the reason that I'm doing this series is not only that I'm a teacher right now and that I teach screenwriting, and my big goal is by the end of the semester that every single student leaves the class enthused about the process of writing, and that no one is leaving the class with writer's block that's going to last 35 years. Why do I say that? Because back when I was at USC, there were a number of us who had very traumatic experiences in writing class. I'm not going to say that I did. I had a very good instructor, and I also had a horrible realization during the course of his class, because he was gentle in the way he taught us, that I didn't have any talent. And while that seems like it's a very devastating revelation, it was actually the start of my career because it allowed me to know that that was not going to be a road open to me, but that I could be a shadow artist. And so I became a development exec, and now I act as a consultant for other people as well, in addition to teaching it. So my goal is to show you what a development exec looks for, because after all, the more you know what a development exec looks for, the more you know who your ultimate buyer is going to be, probably the more likely it is that you can come up with something that at least conforms in your pitch to what you think they want to hear. Now, I know that a lot of you are going to say, well, that's terrible because that's not going for my artistic integrity. And you're absolutely right. But remember, my goal is for you to get something sold, not necessarily to write a masterpiece that will sit in your drawer. So there's certain tricks that you can use, that even if your script might be something that's not necessarily commercial, that you can alter the way you talk about it so that the commercial elements of it come out. Now, I know this is getting old school, but way back when, you had a movie like The Crying Game, which talked about something that was completely uncommercial. Here's a movie that's coming into the American market requiring that you have some knowledge of the IRA and you have some sympathy, and this was way before the Ellen Show, some sympathy toward the gay community and the transgender community before that was even a word. And yet the movie became an enormous hit simply because there were commercial elements in it that seemed to be buried. Now, why do I call it backward engineering? The reason I'm calling it backward engineering is because it starts with what is your talent. And we start with what your talent is and then back it in to who's more likely to buy what you are selling or what kind of material you're going to be writing. Because it makes no sense for you to chase after a genre that's popular if you hate it, because there's certainly a lot of competition out there with people who love it. And guess what? If you love a genre, if you love a type of movie, you're more likely to write a really good one. So we're going to start with that. So let's start today with figuring out what kind of a writer you are. There are three categories of writers that development execs, at least at the time that I was doing it full time, would always talk about. And it was something that I always assumed was just regular nomenclature among the way everybody talked about writing. Then I discovered, once I started teaching, that most people don't think of writers that way, that they think of writers as being rather ubiquitous in what it is they do and what it is they like. So, in general, there's three types of writers that are broadly categorized. One of them is a story-oriented writer. The other is a character-oriented writer. And the third is a writer who is best at scenes. The most important thing for you to do at this point is to decide which of those three categories is the most comfortable for you. I'm not saying that you don't do all three. Of course you're going to have to do all three. But you're going to lead with one of those skills. And the more you can become great at it, the more likely it is that whatever your shortfalls are in the other areas, the less likely they'll matter. Okay, let's start with a story-oriented writer. The story-oriented writer is someone who is very meticulous about structure. And if you think about most of the books about screenwriting, they focus on the story-oriented writer. Why, you might ask? Well, the reason they do is, quite frankly, it's the easiest to teach because it kind of schematizes writing. It doesn't rely on magic. It doesn't rely on you as the instructor going to the student and trying to figure out what's best for them. It's something that you can give to everyone as a generic. I'm not knocking that, by the way. There's something very good about starting out with a good foundational basis. Story-oriented writers most likely will end up writing things that, at their highest and best, work on television in the 1 hour drama or the miniseries type realm. Think about your average, really successful television miniseries. Look at something like Game of Thrones, at least for everything other than its last season. Every episode left you breathless. Every episode left you wanting to say, what happens next? What happens next? Every episode made you feel that the idea of just dropping the series midstream was unthinkable. Yet, look at what happened once it had an ending that was, shall we say, a little bit controversial. Well, the same thing that happened with Sopranos, and the same thing that happened with Lost. You have something that's now a dead asset because sometimes in the 1 hour in the 1 hour drama field, sometimes in the miniseries field, or in the procedural as a feature film, or the detective mystery as a feature film, once you know the ending, there's not necessarily that high a desire to see it again, particularly if the ending is not necessarily satisfying. But during the course of its initial run, that cliffhanger type motif is something that excites people and gets you to tune in much more often. So, uh, story oriented writing is one that is very, very locked in to the three-part dramatic structure, which is actually a Western construct. I've talked to a lot of people who teach writing, and they seem to think it's ubiquitous around the world. It certainly isn't. And maybe because I lived in Japan, I have the advantage of knowing that that's not necessarily the case, that there's a whole different style of looking at the world, and that's going to be exemplified by the style of writing. We'll come to that at a later point and discuss it in more detail, because certainly Quentin Tarantino happens to be a master of writing things in the Japanese style. So, the second type of writer is one who is good with characters. Highest and best for that in terms of a lucrative career is someone who can write sitcoms or romantic comedies. Now, why do I say that? What do you do when you watch a sitcom? You're actually inviting people into your house every week, and it's because you like them. It's because you enjoy being with them. You enjoy their foibles. Notice that on most sitcoms, especially those made after the Mary Tyler Moore Show, you don't necessarily have compelling stories every week. In fact, what most of the quote-unquote stories are is they're nothing but mere coat hangers on which to hang one-liners, or to come up with an excuse to get different people into the room to talk to each other, and or fuss at each other if you want to be more exact about it. And lest you think that this is a negative, one of our great playwrights of the 20th century was Neil Simon. He certainly was a master of that. Can anyone really tell me what the story is for Barefoot in the Park, or The Odd Couple, or Lost in Yonkers? No. Most Neil Simon things are great examples of trying to get people into a room talking to each other. So are most of the classic sitcoms. Even something that's single camera, like Modern Family, still is very much less about the story and more about the character interactions. In the world of romantic comedies, let's face it, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl seems to be one of the most ubiquitous stories of all films and television series at one point or another, right? So how different are they? They're actually not. So again, under someone who is very good with character, I'm saying this with all love and intent. If you are in a screenwriting class, you have a potential to have a challenge during that class, because sometimes your characters are going to start taking you on a journey that's far and away from a traditional three-part dramatic structure. I'm going to say, if you were a student of mine, I'd say go for it. And maybe we'll talk about switching your assignment into a pilot or something like that, because it's not going to necessarily be comfortable for you to try to conform to that three-part dramatic structure, in the same way that you can't get that variety of characters that you've met in your life to conform to a three-part dramatic structure. They're going to kind of tell you what they want to do, and you're just going to have to listen to them and worry about the structure later. The third type of writer is a scene-oriented writer. Now, this is one that I get into fights with my fellow professors all the time. Why? Because they look at the whole idea of something like the Marvel Universe, or sometimes episodic movies like James Bond pictures or something like that, as being somehow déclassé, that these are not true art movies because they're highly audience pleasing, and they're not really about anything other than their specific scenes. And a lot of times the spectacle that you're watching. And guess what? The teachers are absolutely right. Guess what else? Audiences don't care about that. Audiences know that they're going to see something that they have a good chance of liking. And like I said, look at the Marvel Universe movies. Those are all highly scene-oriented. They have neither really good stories nor good characters. Now, I know some of you Marvelites are going to come after me with a butcher knife. No, I'm not insulting the series or the characters. What I'm saying about them is that the characters are more types. And within that type, they're very impressive, and they're able to do certain things, and that adds to the spectacle. That adds to making the scenes better. one of the greatest directors of all time, in fact, was highly scene-oriented, and that's Alfred Hitchcock. When you look at an Alfred Hitchcock movie, you will notice that most of the time, the stories don't necessarily make full sense if you sit there and you actually analyze them. And in fact, a lot of times they come perilously close to violating three-part dramatic structure in order to have impressive scenes based on locations and not necessarily on character motivation or need. And yet, Hitchcock's considered one of the great writers. And are his characters great? No. What makes people often think that his characters are great? Well, you have great performers. And Hitchcock was a very good director in that he didn't get in the way of the performers themselves. Doris Day was known for getting frustrated with him because he wouldn't give her feedback on what was going on during The Man Who Knew Too Much. And he goes, well, if I didn't like what you were doing, I would have said something. So, yeah, okay, it's not necessarily encouraging, but he was right. She was doing what he wanted her to do. And certainly if you look at something like Psycho, which violates the rules of three-part dramatic structure completely and is actually more of a sick joke, but and it's actually a sick joke about the production code. It's not a sick joke about murders and transvesticism or any of that. No. It actually was a fight. It's Hitchcock's own way of being a little bit of an imp and fighting against the Hollywood establishment and their set of arcane rules. So, scene-oriented writers tend to dwell today, in the past not so, but today, dwell in the world of the big budget film. And because of that, they're very highly in demand. If you can come up with a crackerjack scene and you can actually fix everything from there. Remember how Hitchcock came up with North by Northwest. He wanted to have a character hanging off the edge of Mount Rushmore. And then he and Ernst Lehman, the screenwriter, decided who's the least likely person. Well, certainly not a mountain ranger because it's someone who is likely to have that happen. And they figured the person least likely that could happen with was a businessman. And from there, they just took it backwards. How does that businessman get to the top of Mount Rushmore? What is the danger he's in? And that's how North by Northwest came about. So, as you see, there's 3 different types of writers. Please think seriously about what kind of a writer you are, because each of those will give you an incredible set of options. Moreover, if you're having a problem writing and you happen to be scene-oriented or character-oriented and you can't understand why your first plot point isn't falling on the right page, you can tell yourself, okay, it just won't. And so what? Remember that too. The 2 most important words in show business are so what. So whenever anyone says anything to you that sounds like an engraved commandment and you don't agree with it, always think of so what. It might be true for most, but it might not be true for you. And remember, your goal is to get a script finished. And once you do that, the rest becomes much easier.